Imagine for a moment you're in ancient Rome. You've just used one of its famous public toilets, a marvel of engineering with flushing water. Now it's time to clean up. You reach for the ancient equivalent of toilet paper, a sea sponge on a stick. But there's a catch. It's the only one, and it's shared by everyone. You're expected to give it a quick rinse in the running water at your feet, water already filled with everyone else's waste, and put it back for the next person. Welcome to 10-Minute History. I'm your host, Jake Sullivan, and today we're uncovering the filthy, disease-ridden underbelly of the glorious Roman Empire and how a single pandemic brought its golden age to a horrific end. When we think of Rome, we picture order and power. We see disciplined legions, stone-paved roads, and magnificent aqueducts that carried millions of gallons of water into a thriving capital. It was a civilization that seemed to have conquered the natural world. But this picture is incomplete. Lurking unseen in the shadows, an enemy far more relentless than any barbarian warrior was waiting. That enemy was the microbe. The story of Rome is not just one of emperors and battles. It's a story of a civilization's constant and ultimately losing war against disease. To understand this, we have to look at the world the Romans built, a world that was both a marvel of public health and a perfect breeding ground for sickness. The city of Rome itself was a paradox. At its peak, 1 million people were crammed into a space not surpassed in size until 19th-century London. The wealthy lived in spacious homes, the stauntaddomus, with private courtyards, running water piped in from the aqueducts, and their own latrines flushed directly into the sewer. But the vast majority of Romans lived in towering, rickety apartment blocks called insulae. These were dark, crowded, and squalid fire traps with no running water and no sanitation. For these residents, getting rid of waste meant one thing: tossing it out the window and onto the street below. The streets of poorer neighborhoods would have been a foul swamp of garbage, human waste, and animal dung, an ideal breeding ground for flies and rats. This filth, combined with high population density and a warm climate, created what we can call the background noise of endemic disease. Life expectancy at birth was a shocking 25 to 30 years, largely because half of all Roman children didn't live to the age of 10. Diseases like typhoid and dysentery were rampant, spreading through contaminated food and water. Malaria was so common around the city it was known simply as Roman fever. And in the cramped, poorly ventilated apartment blocks, airborne diseases like tuberculosis spread like wildfire. The population of the empire was perpetually weak, fragile, and primed for a catastrophe. But weren't the Romans famous for their hygiene? Yes, but their understanding was based on a flawed idea called the miasma theory. They believed disease came from bad air rising from swamps and decaying matter. This led to incredible engineering solutions. 11 major aqueducts poured over 260 million gallons of fresh water into Rome every day, feeding public fountains, flushing sewers, and supplying the grand public baths. The Great Sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, was a subterranean marvel that carried waste out of the city center. And the public baths, or farmi, were vast leisure complexes where anyone, for a tiny fee, could get clean. But these systems had critical weaknesses. The aqueduct water was a luxury for the rich. Most people got water from public fountains that could easily get contaminated. The sewer didn't connect to the poor insulae and simply dumped raw sewage into the Tiber River. And the magnificent baths? Their warm, undisinfected waters were a perfect soup for bacteria, spreading skin and eye infections among the thousands of daily bathers. The Romans built a world of unprecedented cleanliness, but without knowing about germs, they couldn't stop the real threat. This fragile world was about to collide with a new and terrifying killer. In the year 165 AD, the Roman Empire was at its absolute zenith. It was the Golden Age, ruled by the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius. The empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, enjoying 2 centuries of peace and prosperity known as the *Pax Romana. This golden age was brought to a shuddering halt by a military victory. Roman legions, under the command of co-emperor Lucius Verus, had just won a decisive war against their eastern rival, the Parthian Empire. In 166 AD, they returned home in triumph. But they didn't come home alone. Somewhere in the sacked Mesopotamian city of Seleucia, the soldiers had been exposed to a local pathogen to which they had no immunity. As the victorious legions marched home, they became unwitting superspreaders. The very infrastructure that defined Roman power now became a conduit for its destruction. The plague traveled at the speed of a marching legion, moving along the famous paved roads and infecting every town and fort along the way. From the ports of the Middle East, it boarded ships and sailed across the Mediterranean, the great sea that unified the Roman world. By the end of 166 AD, it had reached the capital itself, brought home by soldiers parading in their own victory parade. From Rome, it spread to every corner of the empire. We know what this disease was like, thanks to the brilliant physician Galen of Pergamon, who was an eyewitness in Rome. He described an illness that began with a high fever, followed by severe diarrhea, vomiting, and a terribly sore throat. But the defining symptom appeared around the 9th day, a horrific skin rash that covered the entire body. Galen described it as black and pustular. For those who survived, the scabs would fall off, leaving disfiguring scars or pockmarks. The illness lasted about 2 weeks and was incredibly lethal. Based on Galen's meticulous description, the vast majority of modern experts believe the Antonine Plague was a devastating, possibly hemorrhagic form of smallpox. The devastation was almost unimaginable. The plague swept through the empire in waves for at least 15 years. Estimating the death toll is difficult, but ancient writers give us a horrifying picture. The historian Cassius Dio reported that during a later resurgence, the disease was killing 2,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. Modern scholars estimate that while the overall mortality rate for the empire might have been around 10%, in the crowded cities and army camps it was far higher, likely between 15 and 25%. In raw numbers, this means somewhere between 6 and 10 million people died. This was a demographic shock on the scale of the Black Death. Faced with this apocalypse, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic philosopher, responded with a mixture of duty, piety, and desperation. First, he turned to the gods. Believing the plague was a sign of divine anger, he summoned priests from all over the empire to perform elaborate rituals and massive animal sacrifices. But the gods were silent, and the plague raged on. This failure of traditional religion would have a profound effect on the Roman psyche. On a practical level, Marcus faced a shattered economy. With taxpayers dying and farms abandoned, state revenues plummeted. At the same time, wars on the frontier demanded huge sums of money. To raise funds without taxing his suffering people, Marcus took an extraordinary step. He held a massive public auction of the imperial family's own treasures in the Forum of Trajan. For 2 months, he sold off priceless jewels, silk robes, ornate furniture, and works of art to keep the state from going bankrupt. But his most immediate crisis was the army. The legions on the Danube frontier were decimated. Seeing this weakness, Germanic tribes poured across the border, starting the grueling Marcomannic Wars that would consume the rest of the emperor's life. To fill the ranks of his hollowed-out army, Marcus was forced to conscript anyone he could find: gladiators, slaves, and even bandits. Crucially, he began recruiting large numbers of barbarian tribesmen directly into the Roman army, a policy that would fundamentally change the military forever. The Antonine Plague marked the end of the *Pax Romana. The demographic wound it inflicted was too deep to heal, and its consequences rippled through Roman civilization for the next century. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, possibly a victim of the plague himself, he was succeeded by his vain and cruel son, Commodus. His disastrous reign plunged the empire into civil war, beginning a long era of political instability. The economy was left in a vicious cycle of decline. The massive loss of life created a severe labor shortage. Farms fell into ruin, mines shut down, and craft production collapsed. With fewer people to tax, emperors resorted to currency debasement, mixing silver coins with cheaper metals. This led to runaway inflation that destroyed savings and shattered public confidence in the currency. The integrated, globalized economy of the Roman world began to fracture, becoming more localized and self-sufficient. This was a major step towards the manorial economy of the Middle Ages. The military was permanently weakened by the manpower crisis. The army became increasingly barbarian in its composition, with loyalties shifting from the state to the generals who paid them, fueling the endless civil wars of the 3rd century. But perhaps the most profound consequence was social and spiritual. The plague created a new age of anxiety. The traditional gods had failed. In this spiritual vacuum, Romans searched for new answers, and many found it in a small, persecuted sect, Christianity. The Christian faith offered two things the old paganism could not. First was the promise of a better afterlife, a message of hope that was immensely appealing when death was so sudden and arbitrary. Second, and most powerfully, was their behavior during the plague. While pagan society fell apart, with families abandoning their sick, Christian communities actively cared for the ill, providing food, water, and comfort. This compassionate response was a powerful form of evangelism. Many who were nursed by Christians or who simply witnessed their self-sacrifice were drawn to a faith that inspired such love. The plagues were arguably the single most important engine of Christian growth, transforming it from a tiny minority into a major force that would one day become the official religion of the empire. As if one blow wasn't enough, the empire was struck by a second pandemic, the plague of Cyprian in the mid-3rd century. This plague, which may have been a virus like Ebola, delivered another hammer blow to the already reeling empire, further decimating the population and fueling more persecution and chaos. So what can we learn from this ancient catastrophe? The story of the Roman plagues is a timeless lesson on the fragility of even the mightiest civilizations. It's a mirror to our own time. The Romans, globalized world, with its roads and shipping lanes, acted as super-spreader highways, just as modern air travel does today. Their struggles with misinformation, like the charlatan who sold a useless magic verse to ward off the plague, feel eerily familiar. And the economic fallout they experienced, from labor shortages to inflation, is a chilling precedent for the disruptions we've seen in our own era. The story of plague in Rome is a profound lesson in humility. For all its power and genius, the Roman Empire was brought to a turning point by a microscopic organism. It reminds us that history is shaped not just by human ambition, but by the indifferent forces of biology. The aqueducts show what the Romans could control. The mass graves show what they could not. So what are your thoughts on this? Let us know down in the comments below. If you found this interesting or learned something new, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to 10-Minute History for more deep dives. Thanks for listening.